We think we know what desperation looks like. We walk past it every day. But what happens when your own innocent children force you to stop and really see it? This is a story about a man who thought he had life under control, and the day his 6-year-old triplets led him to a park bench where a shattered young woman was trying to disappear. They held her hand and looked at him. And in that moment, he had to choose: walk away from the discomfort, or step into a mystery that would unravel everything he thought he knew about loss, luck, and who a person really is. His name was David Miller, and his entire world was those 3 little girls. A widower for 2 years, his life was a meticulously planned routine of school runs, packed lunches, and protecting his family from any more pain. The woman on the bench was a problem his mind immediately categorized: a void for safety, for stability. But his daughters, with their innate and unwavering compassion, saw a person. They forced a simple, devastating question onto their father's conscience. In a world that teaches us to look away, what do we owe to someone who's utterly alone? And what if her story is nothing like what you assumed? David's life had become a fortress of soft routines. After his wife Alina's sudden passing 2 years prior, every decision was filtered through a single priority: stability for his girls. He worked as a structural engineer, a job that suited his need for order, for things that followed predictable laws. His world was a closed system: home, school, the park, repeat. The park was their Saturday ritual. A safe, green space where the triplets, Chloe, Emma, and Sophia, could run while he watched from his usual bench, a man holding the fragile piece he'd built. The woman was a new variable. He'd seen her there for 3 weeks, always on the far bench by the old oak, always alone, head down, shoulders hunched inside that oversized gray hoodie. David's policy was deliberate non-engagement. He taught the girls to be kind, but also cautious. Not everyone is safe, he'd explained, a necessary lesson that felt like a betrayal of the wider kindness Alina had embodied. So when he looked up from his phone that Saturday and didn't see the flash of 3 lavender dresses by the swings, his heart didn't just skip a beat, it dropped. He found them 2 benches over, clustered around the woman in gray. Chloe was holding her hand. Emma was offering a half-eaten cookie. Sophia, the most sensitive, was just looking at the woman's face with deep, wondering eyes. David moved quickly, a low "girls, come here now" already on his lips. The woman flinched at his tone, pulling her hand back as if burned. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice raspy from disuse. "They just came over." She stood up, ready to flee. That's when all 3 girls reached for her. "Don't go," little Sophia pleaded. And then they all turned their identical, imploring faces to him. The internal calculation was instantaneous: risk versus compassion, the unknown versus a teaching moment. He saw the woman's bruised knuckles, the hollows under her eyes, the profound exhaustion, but he also saw the utter lack of threat in her downcast gaze. "It's okay," David heard himself say, the words surprising him. "They're just friendly." He managed a tight smile. "I'm David. These are my daughters." "Sarah," the woman whispered, not meeting his eyes. She looked like she wanted the bench to swallow her. That was the first crack. He bought her a coffee and a sandwich from the kiosk, making the transaction brief and impersonal. The girls chattered, oblivious to the social chasm they just bridged. Sarah ate like someone who'd forgotten how: small, mechanical bites. When they left, Sophia waved until they were out of sight. "She's sad, Daddy," Sophia stated in the car. "We should help her be less sad." The following Saturday, she was there again. The girls ran to her immediately. This time, David followed. He sat on the other end of the bench, a respectful distance. He learned fragments. She was 28. She'd been between places for about 4 months. She was from out of state. The bruises on her hands, she said, were from a fall. Her story was full of silent gaps and evasions, but her manner with the children was gentle, naturally patient. She listened to their convoluted stories with a focus they adored. David began a plan for it: an extra piece of fruit, a spare bottle of water. It became part of the routine. He told himself it was modeling charity for his daughters, but a part of him, the part that still talked to Alina in quiet moments, knew it was more. This woman, Sarah, was a problem his engineering mind couldn't solve, a load-bearing stress with no clear blueprint for reinforcement. The turning point came on a cold, drizzling Tuesday. It wasn't park day. David was working from home, the girls at school, when a call came from the principal. Sophia had spiked a fever. He drove to the school, bundled her up, and decided a short walk in the fresh air might help before medicine. He drove to the park, the nearest green space, and he saw her, not on a bench, huddled under the slide in the children's playground, shivering in the damp, trying to stay out of the rain. She wasn't supposed to be here on a Tuesday. This was her home. Sophia, fever bright and uninhibited, saw her too. "Sarah," she cried, wriggling out of his arms and running over. The sight of his sick child rushing toward that damp hiding place shattered David's last wall of detached charity. This wasn't a Saturday social issue. This was a human being in acute distress. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice firm, not unkind. "It's 50 degrees and wet, you'll get pneumonia." Sarah just shook her head, ashamed. "I'm fine." But she was clearly not. In that moment, David made a decision that bypassed all his careful risk assessments. "Come on, get in the car, I have a guest room, it's empty. One night, to get dry and warm." The refusal in her eyes was automatic, fierce. But then she looked at Sophia, who was coughing a little, yet still looking at her with pure concern. The fight left Sarah's shoulders. She nodded once. The car ride was silent. The house felt suddenly different with her in it. She stood in the foyer, looking lost and gigantic in her vulnerability. David showed her to the guest room, gave her towels, some of Alina's old sweatpants, and a sweatshirt that he'd never been able to part with. "Bathrooms there. Get warm." An hour later she emerged, cleansed, the grime of the park washed away. She looked younger and somehow more haunted. The clean clothes hung off her thin frame. She helped David make soup for Sophia, her movements precise, almost institutional. She knew her way around a kitchen too well. That night, after Sophia was asleep, David found her in the living room, not sitting but standing perfectly still, staring at a family photo on the mantel. It was from before Alina's illness, all 5 of them, a chaos of joy. "You had a beautiful family," Sarah said softly. "I still do," David replied. He gestured for her to sit. "Sarah, what happened? How does someone like you end up under a slide in the rain?" It was the direct question he'd avoided for weeks. She wrapped her arms around herself. "There's no someone like me," she said, a flash of old bitterness in her voice. "That's the point. I made a series of terrible choices. I trusted the wrong person, and then there was just no way back." She wouldn't elaborate, but as she turned from the mantel, the light caught her face cleanly. For the first time, without the matted hair and the hood shadowing her features, David really saw her. And a dizzying, impossible thought began to form. The line of her jaw, the particular shade of her blue eyes. It reminded him of a news segment he'd half-watched weeks ago, a missing person bulletin from a city a few states over. A young professional woman. He'd barely paid attention. But now the ghost of that memory slammed into him. He pushed it away. It was absurd. The coincidence was astronomical. The next morning, he drove the girls to school. Sarah insisted on leaving, her old wall of shame rebuilt. He convinced her to at least take a bag of groceries, a old but sturdy backpack, and $100 bill for a proper motel just for a night or two. He also, almost without thinking, slipped one of his business cards into the side pocket. "If you need anything, no strings." She took the bag, her eyes wet. "Your daughters, they're miracles. You have no idea what they've given me." She walked away, not looking back. David spent the day trying to focus on work, but the nagging thought wouldn't leave. During his lunch break, he typed a few vague search terms into his computer. Missing woman, the neighboring state, the approximate age. He scrolled, not expecting to find anything. And then he saw it. A headline from 2 months ago, "Family pleads for information on missing daughter." He clicked. The photo loaded. It was a professional headshot. A woman with clean, blonde hair, a confident smile, sharp business attire. The eyes were the same. The jawline was the same. The name below the photo was not Sarah. It was Alina Chase. David stared at the screen. the buzzing of his office fan fatting into a dull roar in his ears. Alina Chase, 28, a junior portfolio manager at a respected investment firm, reported missing by her family nearly 10 weeks ago after she failed to show up for her sister's wedding. The article quoted police saying there were no signs of foul play, but noted her personal accounts had been drained in the days before her disappearance. It suggested a voluntary vanish. The comments section was a brutal mix of concern and cynicism. She probably ran off with a boyfriend, or another rich kid having a crisis. But the woman in his guest room last night was not a rich kid. She was hollowed out by hunger and fear. The math didn't add up. A voluntary disappearance doesn't end with you shivering under a playground slide. David's finger hovered over the contact number for the detective listed in the article. His engineer's mind presented two paths. One, call the authorities, hand over the problem, and protect his family from whatever chaos followed. Two, find Sarah first. Ask the question himself. The memory of Sophia's pleading eyes tipped the scale. He couldn't unleash cops on her without warning. She'd run, and he'd never forgive himself. He spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended anxiety. He went to the park at odd hours. She wasn't there. The backpack he'd given her with his card was his only tether. On the third evening, as he was bathing the girls, his phone rang. A blocked number. He answered, his heart hammering. Hello. Silence, then a shaky breath. It's Sarah. Her voice was a thin wire. I saw the card. I need to tell you something before you hear it somewhere else. They met in a neutral public place, a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. She sat in a corner booth, the backpack clutched to her chest like armor. She looked worse than before, jumpy, her eyes scanning the room. David slid into the seat opposite her. He didn't ask, he just waited. My name is Sarah, she said, the words coming out in a rushed whisper. It's Alina Chase. You probably already know that. She saw the confirmation in his eyes and flinched. I didn't run away for fun. I ran because I was drowning, and because someone was pushing my head under. The story spilled out in fragments between sips of terrible coffee. It wasn't a tale of simple misfortune. Alina had been successful, ambitious. Then she'd met a man, Marcus Thorne, charming, older, connected. He'd swept her off her feet and slowly into his financial world. He'd convinced her to make a series of confident moves with her own money, then with small, discretionary client funds he assured her were flexible. It was a classic pump and dump scheme, but she'd been too infatuated to see it. When it collapsed, Marcus vanished, leaving her holding the bag. The firm discovered the discrepancies. She was facing not just job loss, but prosecution, financial ruin, and the utter destruction of her family's reputation. I was going to be the scandal, she said, tears of shame cutting tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. The greedy young banker who stole from her clients. My parents, they're good people. I couldn't let them live with that. I thought if I disappeared, the story would die with me. I took what cash I had left and just started walking. The money ran out in this city. The shame, it's a heavier weight than any backpack. I couldn't call them. How do you call and say, hey, I'm not dead, I'm just a massive disappointment living in a park? David listened, the pieces snapping into a horrifying picture. This wasn't a homeless woman down on her luck. This was a fugitive from a white-collar crime, yes, but more so, a victim of predation who had chosen social death over facing the music. The police report said no foul play, David said gently. Because I left a note, Alina confessed, looking down. I said I needed to start over, that I was safe. I made it sound like a midlife crisis. I thought it would protect them from the worst truth, but it also meant the police stopped looking. I became a voluntary walkaway, not a victim. Here was the pivot that reframed everything. David had assumed a simple narrative. Fallen woman needs help. The reality was a convoluted trap of manipulation, finance, and a justice system that had closed the book because she'd asked it to. His problem was no longer just humanitarian. It was legal, ethical, and deeply dangerous. Helping her now meant potentially obstructing an investigation, harboring someone wanted for questioning. You have to go back, David said, his voice low but firm. You have to face it. This man, Marcus, he's the criminal, you're a witness, maybe even a victim, but hiding like this, it's not a life. Look what it's done to you. I can't, she sobbed. You don't understand. Marcus has friends, he's connected. If I go back and talk, I'll end up taking the whole fall, or worse. He made threats. Not to me, to my family. Accidents happen, he said. The fear in her eyes was primal, convincing. It was the fear that had driven her into the shadows. David drove home that night, his mind a battlefield. His duty to his daughter screamed at him to drop this, to call the detective first thing in the morning. But his duty to Alina's memory, to the concept of basic decency, argued back. Alina was trapped, and his children, in their innocent wisdom, had seen a person worth saving when the rest of the world saw a statistic or a culprit. He made a decision. He would help her, but on a condition. We need a lawyer, he told her at their next meeting. A good one, someone who can navigate this. I will vouch for you. I will tell them how I found you, what state you were in. That proves you weren't on some spa vacation, but you have to be prepared to tell the whole truth to everyone. She agreed, a flicker of hope battling the terror in her eyes. David, using his carefully managed savings, reached out to a former classmate who practiced criminal defense. He outlined the situation hypothetically, then concretely. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Amanda Cruz, was intrigued but wary. David, you're involving yourself in a potential felony case. You have children, think. I am, he said. The plan was for Amanda to make contact with the detective on the case, broker a protected re-entry. But the system, once set in motion, developed a mind of its own. Before any call could be made, the chain reaction began. Alina, growing slightly bolder with David's support, used a library computer to log into an old, forgotten email account, just to see if there was any word from her sister. It was a mistake. The login triggered a security alert her family had set up. Within hours, her father received a notification, an IP address in David City. He didn't call a lawyer, he called the police. And the police, seeing a breakthrough in a cold missing person case, moved fast. 2 days later, a squad car and an unmarked sedan pulled up in front of David's house just as he was loading the triplets into the car for school. A detective, a weary-looking man named Russo, approached. David Miller, we'd like to ask you some questions about an Alina Chase. We have reason to believe you've been in contact with her. The girls stared wide-eyed. Chloe pointed. Daddy, is that about Sarah? In that moment, David knew the careful containment was over. The story was about to burst out of the park bench and into his living room, his neighborhood, his life. He had tried to manage the crisis. Now, the crisis was going to manage him. Time seemed to warp in the driveway. David's primary instinct to shield his girls kicked in like a circuit breaker. He straightened up, placing himself between the detective and the car. Girls, get inside. Now, go to the playroom. His voice left no room for argument. Wide-eyed but obedient, they scrambled out and ran up the front steps, casting frightened glances over their shoulders. Detective Russo, David said, keeping his voice calm. This is my home and those are my children. You can ask me questions, but not here, not like this. Russo's partner, a younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. Russo's tired eyes assessed David, then the house, then the retreating girls. He gave a slow nod. All right, Mr. Miller, we can go down to the station or we can talk inside, your choice, but we need to talk now. They went inside. David offered coffee he didn't have, a stalling tactic. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, and asked if she could watch the girls for an hour. The domestic normalcy of the request seemed to further unsettle the officers. Once the girls were next door, David sat at his kitchen table with the two policemen. He decided on a modified truth. He admitted to meeting a woman named Sarah in the park, that his daughters had taken a liking to her, that he'd offered occasional help. He described her as down on her luck, evasive about her past. He did not mention the night she stayed over. He did not mention Alina Chase. Did you know she was a missing person? Russo asked, his notebook open. No, David answered truthfully. She never gave a last name. She seemed like she wanted to be left alone by the world. I respected that. Russo studied him. The login trace puts her here in this neighborhood. You're the only connection we have. If you're helping her hide from an active investigation, that's obstruction, Mr. Miller. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. There are financial crimes attached. The word obstruction landed like a physical weight. David kept his face neutral. I'm not hiding anyone. If I see her again, I'll encourage her to contact her family. Can you give me a number to pass along? They left him with a card and a warning. The moment their car turned the corner, David's composure cracked. He leaned against the closed door, his mind racing. They were watching him now. Any move to help Alina directly would be seen. He called Amanda Cruz, the lawyer, and relayed the interaction in a frantic whisper. They're fishing, Amanda said, her voice sharp with focus. But the fishing line is right over your head. You need to stop all contact with her, right now. Let me handle the outreach to the detective from here. If she reaches out to you, you tell her to call me immediately and then you hang up. Do you understand? You are now a person of interest. It was sound, professional advice. It was also impossible, because later that night, as David was trying to explain a sanitized version of events to the girls, the police are looking for Sarah's family to help her. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a dirty alleyway, a dumpster, and a single word: help. The "it gets worse" moment wasn't just the text. It was what he found when he disobeyed his lawyer and drove to the location, a desolate industrial area. Alina wasn't just scared, she was bleeding. A shallow, vicious cut ran along her forearm. She'd been jumped, she said, by a man who didn't take her wallet, just hissed a message: stop digging, vanish for real. He'd taken the backpack with David's business card inside. This changed everything. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a white-collar schemer hiding from the law. He was active, he had found her, and he was willing to use violence to keep her silent. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was here in their city, and it had David's name on a card in its possession. David didn't take her to a hospital, he couldn't. He took her back to his house, a reckless move that made his skin crawl, but the alley had felt like a trap. He cleaned and bandaged the cut in his downstairs bathroom, his hands steady but his mind screaming. Alina was trembling uncontrollably. He knows I talked to someone. He knows where I am. He'll find me here. I've put you in danger. For the first time, David felt real, cold fear for his family's safety. This wasn't about legal trouble anymore. This was about a violent man who now had his address. He called Amanda again, this time describing the assault. Amanda's tone shifted from cautious to urgent. David, you need to call Detective Russo, right now. You report the assault. You tell him everything you know about Thorne. You turn her in for her protection and yours. The system can protect her better than you can. But Alina gripped his arm, her eyes wild. No, you don't understand. What if the cop who shows up is one of his friends? What if I get into a squad car and never make it to the station? He said he had people everywhere. Paranoia or a genuine insight into Marcus Thorne's reach? David was paralyzed. Trust a system that had already written her off as a runaway, or trust the gut feeling that had started on a park bench? He made a third choice. He called Russo, but he framed it as a follow-up. He said he'd been thinking and remembered Sarah mentioning a man named Marcus who had hurt her. He gave no details of the assault, no indication she was with him. He was testing the waters, trying to gauge the detective's reaction. Russo was quiet for a long moment. Marcus Thorne, he finally said. That's a name that came up in our financial tracing, a real piece of work. Multiple investigations, never anything that sticks. If your Sarah is mixed up with him, Mr. Miller, she's in deeper water than you know, and so is anyone helping her. The warning was clear, but it didn't sound like a threat from a corrupt cop. It sounded like the warning of a tired detective who'd seen how these things go. The revelation stacked upon itself. Marcus was a known entity, a slippery predator with a history of evading consequences. This meant Alina's fear was justified, but it also meant law enforcement might already be looking at him. The path forward wasn't clearer, it was just more dangerous from every angle. David hid Alina in his finished basement, a temporary, terrible solution. He installed a motion sensor light in the backyard. He lay awake listening for every crackle of gravel on the street. The pressure was fracturing his carefully ordered life. The girls sensed his tension, becoming clingy and anxious. He was failing at the one job he had sworn to master, being their protector. Then came the second-order consequence. A social worker from Child Protective Services arrived for a wellness check, prompted by an anonymous tip about unstable adults around minor children. The police visit had sparked the bureaucracy into action. David had to submit to a humiliating interview about his judgment, his guest, his stability. He passed, but the stain was on his record. The message was clear. His parenthood, his most sacred duty, was now under a microscope. He was being squeezed from all sides. The system, the threat from Marcus, the needs of a traumatized woman, and the terrified eyes of his daughters. He couldn't hold it all. Something had to give. The breaking point and the major transition came 3 days later. David, exhausted, was checking a news app on his phone. A local business brief caught his eye. Out-of-state investor acquires prominent downtown properties. The investor's name was a holding company, but the principal was listed, Marcus Thorne, and one of the properties was a half-built condominium complex whose structural engineering contracts were out for bid. David's firm was preparing a proposal. The world shrunk to the size of his phone screen. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a ghost from Alina's past. He was here, investing, building, weaving himself into the fabric of the city. He was entering David's professional orbit. This was no longer about sheltering a victim. This was about the predator walking into the same room, wearing a suit and a smile. David walked down to the basement. Alina was sitting on the futon, staring at the wall. He showed her the article. The color drained from her face. "He's not hiding," she whispered. "He's moving in. He's making himself untouchable here." David looked at her, then at the bandage on her arm, then thought of the social worker's visit, of his daughter's confusion. The quiet engineer who sought order reached his limit. A cold, determined clarity settled over him. Running, hiding, reacting. It was all losing. The only way to protect everyone, to end this, was to attack the problem at its source. "We're done playing defense," David said, his voice low and steady. "He wants to be a pillar of the community. Then we're going to introduce him to the community. We're going to build a case so public and so solid that not one of his friends can bury it. We're not just going to tell your story, Alina. We're going to prove his." The plan was not elegant, but it was structurally sound. David, the engineer, approached the problem of Marcus Thorne like a failing load. You don't just patch the cracks, you expose the flawed foundation. With lawyer Amanda Cruz now fully engaged, they constructed a 3-part strategy. First, they would legitimize Alina. Amanda facilitated a secured, recorded video call with Detective Russo, where Alina, trembling but clear, gave a formal statement detailing Marcus's fraud and the assault in the alley. Russo, seeing her condition and hearing the specifics, shifted from seeing a fugitive to seeing a key witness. He agreed to open a formal assault investigation and coordinate with the Financial Crimes Unit from Alina's home state. Second, they would attack Marcus's new facade. David, using his professional standing, scheduled a meeting with the city's Business Development Board. He didn't mention Thorne. He simply raised a question about the due diligence process for new investors, citing potential reputational risks that could impact major projects. It was a seed of doubt planted in official soil. The third part was Alina's. She needed to reclaim her narrative before Marcus could twist it further. With Amanda's counsel, she drafted a letter to her parents. It was raw, unflinching. She confessed her professional shame, her gullibility, her fear, and the reason for her disappearance. She sent it along with a recent photo, not as the polished portfolio manager, but as the weary, hopeful woman in David's basement. The response was a storm of tears, forgiveness, and a determined vow from her father. "We are coming. We are bringing lawyers. We are ending this." The system, once an object of terror, began to grind in their favor. The assault investigation gave Russell cause to bring Marcus in for questioning. It was a non-arrest interview, but it forced Marcus into the open, under the fluorescent lights of an interrogation room. He was smooth, dismissive. He called Alina unstable, a jilted lover who had embezzled and then framed him. But the questions were a public enough event to stain his new, shiny local reputation. The Business Development Board quietly paused approval on his permits, citing pending background verifications. Marcus's response was not a retreat but a reckless escalation. He hired a private investigator who began digging into David's life, his work, his finances, the tragic death of his wife. The intent was clear: to discredit and intimidate. David received a packet at his office containing photos of his house, his daughters playing in the yard, and a printout of Alina's obituary. No note. The message was visceral, but instead of folding, David took the packet directly to Detective Russo. "This is witness intimidation," he stated, "and these are my children." The game had changed. Marcus was no longer just a threat to Alina. He had crossed a line that mobilized the full protective apparatus of the law. A restraining order was issued. The investigation into him intensified. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom or a dark alley. It happened in the sterile conference room of David's engineering firm. Marcus, desperate to unstick his permits, had demanded a meeting with the partners to address the baseless rumors being spread by a disgruntled employee, David. It was a colossal miscalculation. David was ready. He wasn't alone. Seated beside him was Amanda Cruz, and on a laptop screen via a secured video link was Alina Chase, now physically safe in a hotel with her parents and a federal marshal outside the door. Also on the call was Detective Russo. The partners, expecting a tense HR meeting, were stunned into silence. Marcus, flanked by his own lawyer, walked in with a practiced smile that died the moment he saw the setup. David didn't yell. He spoke like he was presenting a forensic report. He outlined the timeline: Alina's recruitment, the fraudulent scheme, her disappearance, the assault, the intimidation of his family. He presented copies of the photos sent to his office. He played a 30-second audio clip provided by Alina of a voicemail from Marcus early in their relationship, casually discussing moving client funds to a special account. It was a smoking gun she'd forgotten she had. Marcus's lawyer immediately tried to shut it down, threatening defamation suits. But then Detective Russo's voice came through the laptop speaker. "Mr. Thorne, based on evidence presented today and in our ongoing investigation, I am advising you not to leave the city. We will be in touch with your attorney shortly regarding formal charges." The facade crumbled in real time. Marcus's polished demeanor shattered into a mask of pure, venomous rage. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at David. "You ruined everything for some trash you found in a park," he spat. One of the senior partners, a man who had known David for a decade and had attended Alina's funeral, stood up. "I think you should leave, Mr. Thorne, and I suggest you contact your attorney. Our firm will not be doing business with you, now or ever." The other partners nodded, a wall of silent, professional condemnation. It was over. The victory was quiet, administrative, but total. Marcus Thorne was arrested the next week on charges of fraud, witness intimidation, and assault. The case made local news, painting Alina as a victim who had escaped a predator, and David as the good Samaritan who stood by her. The narrative of the greedy banker was overwritten by the story of the manipulated woman. For Alina, the consequences were profound but not destructive. She faced disciplinary action from her old firm and had to repay the misallocated funds, a debt her family helped with. But the district attorney, recognizing her cooperation and victim status, offered a deal that avoided jail time. Her reunion with her parents was a private, tear-drenched event of healing. The shame that had driven her into the park began to dissolve in the unconditional love of her family. For David, the aftermath was a recalibration of his entire world. The CPS file was closed with a glowing review. The social worker commended his compassion, but the real change was internal. The fortress of routine was gone, replaced by a more open, resilient trust in his own judgment and in the unpredictable goodness of connection. His daughters, who had started it all, saw their father not just as a protector, but as a hero who helped their friend. The surprising detail came 6 months later. It arrived in a thick envelope. Inside were official blueprints and a letter. The blueprints were for a new community center, focused on financial literacy and support for victims of economic abuse. It was to be built on a parcel of land donated by the city. The lead architectural and engineering firm was David's. The letter was from a leaner. "David," it read, "the settlement from the civil case against Marcus came through. This is what I want to build with it. A place where someone who feels as lost as I did can find a hand up, not a handout. I can't think of anyone better to make sure it's built on a solid foundation. And don't worry, I've hired the best project manager I know. Me." David framed the letter. The community center project became his passion, a perfect synthesis of his skills and the journey he'd been through. On the day of the groundbreaking ceremony, he stood at the podium with a leaner, now a confident advocate in a smart blazer, and his 3 daughters, each wearing tiny hard hats. He looked out at the crowd, at the empty plot of earth that would become something strong and useful, and he thought of a park bench. The story that began with averted eyes and a plea from 3 little girls had come full circle, building something permanent from an act of fleeting kindness. The mystery was solved, the threat was neutralized, and the hidden identity had not just been revealed, but reclaimed and redeemed. It was a payoff measured not in victory laps, but in quiet strength, rebuilt lives, and the unbreakable bond of a family that had grown larger in every way that mattered. So what do we take from a story like this? That the world is divided into those who need help and those who can give it. I think it's more complicated. David Miller didn't start out as a hero. He started as a man following a simple, safe script until his children rewrote it for him. They didn't see a homeless woman, a missing person, or a potential criminal. They saw someone who was sad, and in that pure, uncomplicated observation, they held up a mirror to the rest of us. How many times do we walk past our own park benches? How many times do we see a problem that isn't ours and decide, rationally, that engagement is too risky, too messy, too far outside our lane? We tell ourselves we're protecting our own, just as David did. But protection can become a prison. And sometimes the very act of reaching out, of allowing yourself to be vulnerable to another person's chaos, is what fortifies you in ways you never expected. Alina wasn't saved because a billionaire wrote a check. She was saved because a regular man, burdened with his own grief, chose to listen to the quiet pleading in his own heart, amplified by his children's voices. The real transformation was Alina going from homeless to whole. It was David learning that strength isn't found in the walls you build, but in the bridges you're willing to cross, even when the other side is shrouded in fear and uncertainty. The community center they're building is more than a building. It's a monument to a radical idea that our greatest societal problems aren't solved by distant institutions or grand gestures, but by a chain of personal responsibility ignited by simple human curiosity. What if, instead of asking what's wrong with that person, we asked, what happened to you? The difference in those 2 questions can change a life. It can change a community. I want to leave you with this question, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger's plight, big or small, stopped you in your tracks? Did you walk on, or did you stop? And how did that choice, either way, linger with you afterward? Your stories are what make this channel a community. If this narrative reminded you of the power of everyday courage, please hit the like button. It helps more people find these important conversations. Share this with someone who might need a nudge to see the world with a bit more compassionate curiosity. And if you're not already, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We explore the deep, human stories behind the headlines, and we'd love to have you along for the next one. Remember, the most profound moments of our lives often don't happen on grand stages. They happen on park benches, in quiet diners, in the pleading eyes of a child, asking us to be just a little braver and a little kinder than we plan to be. Thank you for watching.